killer.
They're living out there, they're working out there, and now they're dying out there.
The brutal murderer was putting on a show.
He wanted his work to be seen. He was like an artist, laying out the bodies for the public to view.
Collecting grotesque souvenirs.
The first thing we did then is opened the eye socket.
Then they saw that her eyes was missing.
His desire would become insatiable.
They knew that he would strike again. That is the worst nightmare for a detective.
But what was driving his heinous violence?
There's very few times you can look at someone and truly feel an evil person.
And was he born? In the 1990s, Dallas, Texas was a successful, booming metropolis, looking towards a prosperous future.
The city leaders of Dallas always would promote this city as the gleaming, shining symbol of the Southwest. Pure, beautiful, great skyscrapers. Everyone was successful. But at the same time, Dallas had this great, shiny image. Lurking in the background was crime.
Dallas was a very violent city. Matter of fact, the early 90s, we had our largest rate of homicide that we ever had. In 1991, we had over 500 homicides in the city of Dallas.
And one formerly middle-class district to the south of the city had become the center of Dallas's seedy underbelly.
Oak Cliff had gone downhill. It was crime-ridden. You had lots of crime, you had lots of prostitution, you had lots of drugs.
It was not a place that you really wanted to be unless you were down there for a purpose.
Oak Cliff was just a rundown town. It was full of a lot of degenerates. It was a part of Dallas that Dallas was probably ashamed of at that time.
For beat cops Regina Smith and John Matthews, one aspect of the streets would require their undivided attention.
In the middle of the day, you would see prostitutes walking in and out of the street, in and out of stores.
Most of the girls that were out there as prostitutes had a drug problem. Drugs were the crux of their existence. We had established rapport with these girls. You know, we cared about them. And we didn't see them just as prostitutes, we saw them as human beings.
One of the troubled women working in the area was 33-year-old mother Mary Pratt.
Mary was a girl that had worked the streets for quite a while. She grew up not very far from North Oak Cliff, and her family still lived just outside of the city of Dallas.
She loved her family. She had so much great love. And Mary wanted out of the life really bad.
The 12th of December 1990 appeared to be a standard night in Oak Cliff's red light district. Mary had been amongst the scores of girls plying their trade on the notorious Jefferson Boulevard. But the following morning, a gruesome discovery in a nearby residential area would mark the tragic end to a young woman's life.
The body was found right here in this area, and she was partially nude. She had been shot, and she laid splayed out with her arms over her head.
When we got there, it was probably 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, best I can remember, and the body was just left in the street.
As you can see, this isn't in a remote area where no one could see it. There's homes all around here, people coming and going all the time. It was put here for someone to discover.
The victim would be identified as prostitute Mary Pratt. Despite the displaying of her body, her murder was not initially viewed as out of the ordinary.
It was not unusual for street prostitutes to be beaten up, to be shot. It just seemed to be a standard case.
However, the victim's autopsy would reveal that this was anything but a run-of-the-mill murder.
The medical examiner opened the eyelids to write down the color of the eyes in his autopsy report.
And in this particular case, the medical examiner was shocked to find that the eyeballs were gone.
The eyes had been cut out so precisely that when the eyelids were shut, there were no scars, there was no bleeding, no sign of any bleeding. It was surgically precise.
The FBI would confirm to police that the killer's macabre MO was unprecedented.
The eyeball situation, we didn't hear of murders that were sick like that. It was like a trophy or a souvenir.
When someone's going through the trouble to meticulously cut out an eyeball, it tells us killing alone is not psychosexually sufficient. They have to go above and beyond that and do what gratifies them, even placing themselves at risk for apprehension.
50 years earlier, the streets of South Dallas had been far removed from such brutal crimes. Oak Cliff had been a safe haven for a young couple raising their newly adopted son.
Charles was born in 1933 and adopted 3 weeks later by Fred and Dell Albright, a couple that lived in the heart of Oak Cliff. Fred was a grocer in Dallas. Dell was a stay-at-home mom, and she was very much a stay-at-home mom.
She ran the house. His father, Fred, was kind of in the background, and she doted on him, but she was also extremely strict on him.
She was very concerned about him getting in trouble, getting sick, not eating the right foods. She kept goats in the backyard so he would have goat milk instead of cow milk.
Although Charles's mother had a caring side, he would later recall a strict set of rules.
She would force him to practice the piano. She would have him follow her strict rules of manners. If he didn't drink his milk, if he didn't finish his meals, he was severely punished.
There was occasions where if he wouldn't sleep and take his nap, she would tie him down in bed. If he did something wrong, she would punish him by leaving him in a dark room.
Her domination would have affected him. There might have been anger brewing, especially as she controlled him. But she also was very supportive, so there would have been love, so he would have had a lot of mixed feelings about women.
Although the Albright household was run as a strict regime, the mother and son spent any downtime indulging a shared passion for taxidermy.
They would go get dead animals in the neighborhood, like squirrels and birds, and they would work meticulously on restoring the animals, taking out their insides, sewing them back up. And then the final part of the taxidermy was to take these beautiful little fake eyes that you could order and place them into the animal's eyes.
But his mother was a very frugal woman. She wouldn't pay for these rather expensive marbles for the eyes, so she would just force him to use buttons from her sewing collection.
He would take a bus down to a local taxidermy shop, and he would run his fingers through the boxes of eyes, just staring at the eyes, but never able to buy them to put on his animals.
50 years later, Charles Albright's neighborhood had just suffered the gruesome murder of prostitute Mary Pratt. But as detectives searched for a lead, the killer was already planning his next attack. In December 1990, a shocking discovery was made on the streets of Oak Cliff, Dallas. 33-year-old prostitute Mary Pratt had been brutally murdered and grotesquely mutilated by the surgical removal of her eyes. As police searched for clues, beat cops Regina Smith and John Matthews turned to the local girls working the red light district on Jefferson Boulevard.
They know the streets better than anyone. They're living out there, they're working out there, and now they're dying out there. The word on the street from the girls was that they felt the murderer had to be somebody that Mary knew, someone that had probably been out there on the street for a significant amount of time.
What the girls were saying, they would think of their worst customers that had treated them badly, and none of it fit the profile of what we were seeing. You know, some of them were just, totally way off.
Police were further baffled by the dumping of Mary's body. She was known to have been working around Jefferson Boulevard, but her body had been discovered in a residential area some distance away.
Mary, like most of the girls, would turn their tricks only in a very small geographic area. They wanted to stay close to their pimp and close to where they had friends. And having the body discovered a long way away from the Jefferson area was quite extraordinary.
Although officers Smith and Matthews had little to go on, an encounter with local prostitute Veronica Rodriguez appeared to offer a break.
I saw this gash on her throat and a gash on her head, and I said, "What happened to you?" And she said, "I almost got killed. I had to jump in a drain to get away from him." And so we were like, "Really?"
Veronica claimed she had been with Mary Pratt on the night of her murder.
She said that she and Mary double dated this John, and that he had attacked him, and that she got away, but Mary did not.
The distraught prostitute would then describe a terrifying ordeal as she fled the scene.
She ran barefoot and partially clothed across an open field, and she was a very small, thin girl, and she fit inside a drainage pipe. And she heard the attacker yelling her name, trying to find her.
She found her way to the house of someone she knew, and that person saved her.
Despite Veronica's dramatic version of events, her drug-induced state put doubt in the officers' minds.
They just thought the story was the kind of story that Veronica told all the time. But she did definitely look like she had been beaten up.
However, just 2 days later, officers Smith and Matthews would cross paths with Veronica once again, whilst checking out a suspicious truck parked up in Oak Cliff's red light district.
We swung open the doors, and that's when we saw Veronica in the car doing business with Axton Schindler.
Schindler was a local truck driver, renting a house in the area.
Veronica was very agitated. She was very upset, and she kept saying, "Well, he saved me. Leave him alone. Let him go."
"Don't arrest him. Don't arrest him. That's the guy I told you about that saved me. He saved me."
But he really didn't kind of verify the story at the time that she said.
But they took his identification, and Axton Schindler listed his residence as in Oak Cliff.
Although police didn't know it yet, Axton Schindler had actually given the address of his landlord, a local man who had grown up in the neighborhood, 57-year-old Charles Albright. As a child in the 40s, Charles had experienced a strict regime at home. It appeared that this disciplined upbringing had paid off at school.
He was very gifted in science. He was a gifted athlete.
If you met him as a boy, you would think he's going a long way.
He was smart and did well in class, but he also was the type of person who did pranks and would get in trouble a lot. He was a good thief. He would steal the test exams and make copies for his friends.
For him, going through the proper channels, like taking your classes, graduating, that wasn't the way he wanted to run his life. He sees the world as a place where you have to always get over on him.
As Albright hit his late teens, his mischievous behavior started to spiral out of control.
He was arrested for breaking into a jewelry store as a boy and stealing a watch. A juvenile probation officer came to see him and did interviews with him. He had never before met a teenager who was able to divorce reality from falsehood.
Albright could convince himself he hadn't committed a crime. He could lie to himself and be very convinced.
Charlie's delinquent behavior would continue to escalate, and he would eventually be imprisoned for a year, aged just 17. However, on his release, he appeared to have mended his ways.
So he goes to Arkansas State Teachers College. He becomes president of the French Club. He becomes editor of the yearbook. He's on the student council. He tries out for the football team, even though he's never played organized football before, and becomes the starting halfback.
He was very charismatic, very laid back, seemed to get along with everyone, lots of superficial charm.
The colourful Albright would also gain notoriety for his outlandish pranks.
Charlie had a friend in college named Andrew, who was dating the most beautiful girl on campus. She broke up with him. In a fit of despair, he tore up her pictures. Charlie slipped into his room, grabbed the photos from the wastebasket, cut out the eyes, and began pasting them on the ceiling above Andrew's bed, in the bathroom where Andrew used. So wherever Andrew went, there were these photos of the ex-girlfriend's eyes staring at him. It was a hilarious prank. Good old Charlie doing a prank with eyeballs.
"40 years later, local prostitutes were still working Oak Cliff's red light district, despite the twisted murder and mutilation of call girl Mary Pratt.
The girls will get picked up, some will get beat, some will get raped, and some will get murdered. That's kind of the life of a typical prostitute.
But Oak Cliff was about to suffer another brutal killing that would strike an ominous chord with investigating officers.
In February 1991, 2 months after Mary Pratt's body was found, the body of another woman was found on the same street in South Dallas.
Right here in this vicinity was where the body of Susan Peterson was found. Her body was partially nude. She had been shot, and she was laying here displayed.
The prostitute's murder bore marked similarities to that of working girl Mary Pratt.
Both bodies were dumped in the same neighborhood. Both bodies were shot. Both bodies were displayed in the same way, as if the killer wanted them to be discovered quickly.
When a killer just dumps a body, they are, first of all, calling the victim garbage, just dumping them in the streets for pickup. Also, this is a brazen statement against the community itself. This is one of yours, deal with it.
They were not just people to be thrown in the streets like that. The pictures I saw haunted me forever. They still do. So what, they did that? It didn't give anyone the right to take their life from them, nobody the right to take their life from them.
Although Susan's murder had come under a different jurisdiction, on hearing the news, Dallas detectives feared her autopsy would reveal the same hideous mutilation inflicted on the face of Mary Pratt.
They immediately called the medical examiner and said, check the eyes. And they got a call back that said, the eyes are missing. In that moment, the alarms went on, because now they knew they had a serial killer.
They knew that he would strike again. That is the worst nightmare for a detective.
He loved, clearly, taunting the cops. He wanted his work to be seen. He was like an artist, cutting out their eyes and disappearing into the night.
The mutilation of the two innocent women was evidence of a most twisted mind at work. Detectives would soon discover that the killer's lust for trophies was far from over. In February 1991, police had established a serial killer was murdering prostitutes on the streets of Oak Cliff, Dallas. Both Mary Pratt and Susan Peterson had been mutilated in the most horrific manner, their eyes surgically removed during the twisted attacks.
They had to get word out to the prostitutes on the street to warn them that there was a killer out there and that the bodies were mutilated in a certain way.
Everybody was scared. You know, if you say a serial killer that's cutting out prostitutes' eyes is on the loose, it caused a great concern.
But despite police warnings, many girls were left with little choice.
The prostitutes remained out. Many of them had drug addictions. They needed money. I felt sorry for them because they were stuck in a situation that they couldn't get out of.
Amidst an atmosphere of fear, one Oak Cliff resident had to work nights as a paperboy to make ends meet. It was the latest in a long line of jobs for the colourful Charles Albright.
Albright, he couldn't seem to hold the job more than 3 months or he would lose interest in it.
At one point, he bought a lathe and made baseball bats that he sold.
He told people that he was a bullfighter at one time and gone to Mexico.
He got a beautician's degree and called himself Mr. Charlie.
He was an artist at one point.
A guy that worked with him at the beauty shop asked him to paint a portrait of his wife. And Charlie spent hours working on the portrait. Finally, the guy said, "Charlie, when are you going to get done with the portrait?" And Charlie said, "I have just one thing left to do." And the man looked at the portrait, and it was a perfect rendition of his wife, except that the eyes were missing.
But Albright's eccentric demeanour hid a life of petty crime. 22 years earlier, in 1969, he created fake qualifications to land a job as head of biology at a high school east of Dallas.
From there, he coached the football team. High school girls swooned over him. High school boys wanted to be like him. They would come to him for counseling.
He was gregarious, he was charismatic. It was very easy to take people in and make them believe whatever he wanted. That would have made him feel superior.
Having eventually been sacked from his teaching post, Charles Albright continued to commit a series of minor offences throughout the 70s. But 1981 would mark a disturbing addition to his criminal record.
He showed up at this church and then suddenly became quite active in this particular Catholic church. And he befriended a family who had a young daughter.
He liked to talk to the girl, and he would take her to the playground. And at one point, the parents realized after talking to the girl that Charlie had sexually molested her.
The family didn't want to put their daughter through a trial, and the prosecution reached a plea bargain with him, and he was placed on probation.
Charlie was able to keep this completely quiet. It never made the newspapers. So in his world in Oak Cliff, he was still Good Time Charlie. At this church he went to in East Dallas, he was a depraved sexual maniac.
Ten years later, in 1991, panic had set in throughout the wider community of Oak Cliff, following the brutal slaying of 2 white prostitutes.
By the time the second murder had occurred, it was the kind of thing that the newspapers were going to pick up on.
We had people calling in, trying to turn in ex-husbands and friends, and it made a lot more leads for us to have to run down that we later found out that weren't good.
Once it became a media sensation, one of our concerns was that the killer may change his MO.
Which is exactly what happened on March 19th, 1991, 1 month after Susan Peterson was found.
The body of a third prostitute had been discovered in a residential street. Although the victim's profession matched that of Mary Pratt and Susan Peterson, the killer's choice of target had seemingly evolved.
There was a couple differences in this case. The first two had been white females, and Shirley Williams was a black female.
The killer's change of MO had resulted in tragedy for the 45-year-old, who, despite police warnings, had remained out working the streets.
When you look at serial sexual murders, in 70% of the cases, they experiment at a crime scene and do something very, very different that they didn't do before. So if you have a series of 5 murders and 4 of the women are white and 1 is African American, that does not surprise me.
Despite any differences, the killer's brazen brutality was still evident.
When the officers arrived, they found her completely nude and her face was mutilated. Her body was near a school, and she was left where all those children could see her.
She had been shot several times, and it was a bloody scene.
With the cause of death established, there was only one thing weighing on the detective's mind.
Of course, the first thing we did then is opened the eye socket.
They checked and they saw that her eyes was missing.
We knew then that we had a third one.
As with the other 2 murders, the eyeballs had been removed from the scene. But this time, the killer appeared to have acted in a frenzy.
Whereas with Mary and Susan, their eyes had been surgically removed, but Shirley lay here and there were marks around her eyes.
This time, the killer didn't have as much time to precisely get those eyeballs out, and he left part of an X-Acto blade in one of the eye sockets.
As police chased down their leads, Oak Cliff resident Charles Albright remained under their radar. Despite his checkered past, the charismatic 57-year-old had become a popular member of the community. Forensic scientist Dr. Irving Stone recalls the 57-year-old as a welcome addition to his seniors' softball team.
Charlie Albright was kind of a happy-go-lucky fella. Looked like a fire hydrant. He was wide-shouldered, strong. He had a great sense of humor. And I think the fellas on the team generally liked Charlie.
If there was ever any tension or conflict on the softball field, even amongst these old guys get pretty competitive, Charlie was the first to back down. He didn't seem to like physical confrontation.
Alongside his busy social life, Charles also seemed to be living in domestic bliss.
He met a woman, a widow from Arkansas named Dixie, who he woos and says he wants to marry.
She fell victim to his charms, and they eventually moved in together. Dixie thought she was living with Prince Charming, who, she would come home to, and he could read poetry to her and that sort of thing.
Increasingly out of work, Albright's main income was from a string of rental houses passed down from his parents. But as the financial pressure mounted, Dixie was forced to become the main breadwinner, unaware that her partner was leading a double life.
What Dixie could not imagine was that when she was at work at a gift shop during the day, that Charlie would get in his car and drive 10 minutes away to the whore motels out by the interstate and visit prostitutes, and sometimes bring them back to one of his rental houses.
He was very smart, so he had the ability to live in a variety of compartments. So, and each of those compartments would have its own sense of morality and sense of identity, and it would depend on what situation he was in or what mood he was in as to what he was going to do.
The working girls who knew him recall a client who liked to take charge.
He went out and bought drugs for women and said he didn't want them on the streets because he worried about them. Oh, y'all are my girls. Oh, I'll go get you some drugs. I would hate to have anything happen to you.
He would pay for some of their meals, or if they needed money, he would give them $100. And that wasn't even necessarily for sex. He wanted to develop these friendships with them. So they looked at him as someone who was safe to be with.
Oh, he was charming when he wanted to be. He told me I had lovely eyes.
But his acquaintances in the red light district experienced a change in Charles Albright's behaviour.
With some of the prostitutes, he began to develop a sadistic relationship.
You saw two different sides of him. You saw a charming, nice side, and you saw an angry side.
He began tying them up. He would hit some of them with rope or with an extension cord. He would yell at them. He would cuss at them. He got very rough in his sexual activities.
I worked in a psychiatric unit for a long time because I'd been a nurse, and I knew something was wrong.
Although Albright's secret life remained hidden, one unexpected episode would leave his softball buddies in a state of shock.
Two young women drove slowly past the softball team right as the game had come to an end, and some man just said as a joke, "I bet they're prostitutes. Hey, Charlie, why don't you go have a taste of that?" And Charlie turned and looked at that man and said, "I hate prostitutes. If I had my choice, I'd kill them all."
One year later, in March 1991, the twisted murder of a third prostitute had shut down Oak Cliff's red light district.
You could not find a prostitute of any race on the street. It cleared the streets, period.
In an atmosphere of fear, beat cops Smith and Matthews would glean some crucial information from working girl Brenda White.
Brenda told us a story about this older white male driving a station wagon who had picked her up. He was very strong, very muscular. He had salt and pepper hair.
He wanted to take her down to some property he had down south. She, being a veteran prostitute, knew not to go.
He became enraged, and she was so frightened that she had to mace him in order to get out of the car.
On hearing Brenda's description of her assailant, the officers then reconsidered an earlier witness statement from another Oak Cliff prostitute.
That brought to mind Veronica's story, because she said her attacker had salt and pepper hair as well.
Veronica Rodriguez had insisted she had witnessed the brutal murder of Mary Pratt before fleeing to the rental house of middle-aged resident Axton Schindler.
Axton was a small guy, a very kind of shy and passive individual, not someone that could overpower these girls. We knew Axton wasn't the killer.
But when Officer Matthews checked out the address Axton had provided, he discovered it was a property near to where Shirley Williams' body had been discovered. Having eliminated Schindler from the inquiry, police turned their attention to his landlord. Further investigation revealed that he owned more than one property within the immediate area.
I started to run a tax record and discovered there were actually 3 pieces of property, one near Shirley's dump site, 2 near Mary and Susan's dump site, all owned by the same person with the last name of Albright.
As a cop, I was saying, this is that son of a bitch right here. That's who is doing this.
But as police closed the net around Charles Albright, they were about to learn they were dealing with an elusive and calculating adversary. During 1991, a depraved serial killer had struck at the heart of Oak Cliff's red light district. Having connected the 3 murders by the bizarre removal of the victim's eyes, Dallas police finally believed they had their man. 57-year-old Charles Albright fit a witness description and owned several houses within close proximity to where the victims' bodies had been found.
The arrest happened in the wee hours of the morning. The tactical team had lined up and were in position surrounding the home.
They burst in, they grab Charlie, who says he has no idea what they're here for.
Having broken the case, officers Matthews and Smith were tasked with taking the suspect in for questioning.
The atmosphere in the car was just as eerie as one can imagine. It was total silence in the car.
The one thing that I remember is looking back and seeing the darkness in his eyes. It wasn't even like looking into a real person's eyes. It was absolutely amazing and at the same time, absolutely terrifying.
All of the victims had been shot and had bizarrely had their eyeballs removed. But as detectives searched Albright's house, little evidence came to light.
When we started searching the house, we found a fireplace that had a secret cover over the top of it. And once we took that cover off, there were like 7 or 8 guns in there.
None of which were used in the murders of the prostitutes. They do find some X-Acto blades, but they can't connect them to any of the murders. They do not find the eyeballs.
Forensic scientist Dr. Irving Stone was also part of the investigative team that night. Although his search drew a blank, one item found in the living room would leave him in a state of shock.
On the floor in the corner, there was a baseball cap. And I looked at that baseball cap and I said, "What's this guy's name?" And the fellow said, "Charles Albright." And I said, "He's the right fielder on my softball team."
On his return to police headquarters, Dr. Stone came face to face with his former teammate.
The elevator opened and Charlie Albright was ushered out, manacled and in shackles with 2 detectives. And he saw me, he beamed a big smile and he opened his arms and he said, "Irv, come give me a hug." I looked at Charlie and I just shook my head and I moved into the laboratory. But that's the kind of guy Charlie was.
In custody, Albright would remain unperturbed whilst police searched his other properties, desperate to track down the missing body parts.
When we had to search that doggone barn, and it was like a scene from Silence of the Lamb with lizards and snakes and newts. He had them lined up all in that barn, and we thought the eyeballs were going to be in there.
I know that we saw some pickled animals, and on one of them, it even resembled eyes, but it turned out to be, I think, a pig's eyes.
Although the evidence against Albright was still lacking, officers Smith and Matthews would locate the site of Shirley Williams' murder following a tip-off from a local prostitute. The discovery of her coat at the scene provided the turning point in the case.
That directly tied Albright to Shirley Williams.
They found a hair on the raincoat that they couldn't identify at first. And the interesting thing was they found this same type of hair in the vacuum cleaner from Albright's house. And they actually had to go to the zoo and have their experts look at it, and they identified it as a squirrel hair.
They knew that he had vacuumed a truck or something in order for those hairs to get, in that vacuum cleaner.
So that became a crucial piece of evidence.
At trial, Albright would deny he had even frequented the red light district. But ultimately the jury found him guilty of the killing of Shirley Williams. Although he wasn't officially charged with their murders, the cases of Mary Pratt and Susan Peterson were detailed in court. As Charles Albright faced life in prison, the shattered community of Oak Cliff would try to comprehend why this one-time petty criminal had targeted Oak Cliff's working girls in such a brutal manner.
He was adopted, we knew that. And his birth mother might have been a prostitute. And with him living with the thought that his mother was a prostitute, it might have just festered over the years or something like that.
But for many, it was Albright's unprecedented MO to mutilate his victims' eyes that was truly unfathomable.
Albright had never really accomplished a thing in his life. And I think this may have been a way, he was going to make his mark in the world.
There was incidents in his early life that his mother used buttons for eyes in their stuffed animals. And I usually am very reluctant to attribute future behavior as an adult to events in childhood. But in this particular case, I really think it applies.
He will talk at length about his obsession with eyes to this day. In his prison cell, he reportedly had drawings that he had made of beautiful women's eyes, taped one after another across the wall.
In the aftermath of his twisted brutality, one question remained. Was Charles Albright born to kill?
I think the key to Charlie is to understand, despite all his charm and all his cleverness, and that he had, from the beginning, an antisocial personality. His adoptive mother, Dell, perhaps sensed it, and maybe that's why she raised him so diligently. She knew that her son was going to spiral out of control.
I think Albright was born to be a con artist, to be a person who would do whatever he wanted. And so if murder was something that appealed to him, he was ready to do it.
Even though he had a strange childhood, he wasn't abused in any way. He wasn't sexually abused. He wasn't physically abused, really. I think it was more genetic.
For many, the memory of the brutal murders has faded away. But those who were there will always remember the innocent women who lost their lives.
I miss my friends. Felt like I could have done something. How dare this person come and take their life and cut it short? There was something wrong about her from the beginning. There's just...
The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when the call came in, a thin, crackling voice on a recorded line, the kind of call detectives remember for the rest of their lives, the kind that turns coffee cold in your hands, because it didn't begin with a name or a demand or even an apology. It began with a sentence that cut through 20 years of silence like a blade. I was there the night she disappeared, and I can't carry it anymore. The clock on the wall read 2:17 a.m., red digits glowing in the dark, the building half asleep, Oregon wrapped in wet asphalt and mist, and in that moment the past stopped being past, a cold case file shuddering awake, dust lifting from paper that had not been touched since the Clinton administration, since flannel shirts and payphones and a town that believed bad things happened somewhere else. Back then it was a Wednesday, the kind of ordinary day that never makes headlines until it does, the kind of day parents remember forever because it was the last time they saw their child alive, and the air that morning had smelled like pine and damp earth, the smell that still clings to the memory like it refuses to let go. The town sat between forest and highway, a place you could miss if you blinked, a place with one blinking traffic light and a diner that closed at 8, where people waved even if they didn't know your name, where doors were locked but not out of fear, more out of habit, and when she vanished it felt like the ground itself had shifted, like the trees leaned in closer to listen. She was 22, home for the summer, working shifts at a grocery store, saving money, making plans that never made it past a spiral notebook on her desk, plans for travel, for escape, for something bigger than a town that felt too small once you learned how big the world could be. That night she told her mother she'd be back by 10, told her father she loved him, grabbed her jacket even though it wasn't that cold, and walked out into a street lit by orange sodium lamps, her footsteps swallowed by the sound of rain starting up again. By midnight, she hadn't come home. By 1 the worry had settled in, heavy and undeniable. By dawn the phone calls had begun, friends first, then hospitals, then police, and by noon her face was being photocopied and taped to windows, a smile frozen in cheap ink, the word missing printed underneath, like a challenge. Officers walked the route she was known to take, boots splashing through puddles, flashlights catching nothing but wet leaves and cigarette butts. No sign of a struggle, no abandoned purse, no jacket, no blood, nothing that made sense, and that absence was the first cruelty of the case, the way it gave nothing back. The highway roared nearby, trucks passing through without slowing down, and for the first time the town felt exposed, like it sat too close to a road that could carry anyone away. Tips came in fast at first, voices shaking with certainty, everyone convinced they'd seen something, a car idling too long, a stranger at the bar, a scream that might have been a fox, detectives scribbling notes, pinning timelines, chasing leads that dissolved in the rain, and the days turned into weeks, weeks into months, the search parties thinning as hope quietly bled out. Her parents kept the porch light on, night after night, an unspoken signal, a ritual that bordered on superstition, because turning it off felt like surrender, and every time a car slowed on the street their hearts leapt, only to sink again as the taillights disappeared into the dark. The investigation slowed, not because it didn't matter, but because there was nothing left to grab onto, no body, no crime scene, no suspect who stayed suspicious long enough to stick, and the file grew thick with paper and thin with answers. Detectives rotated out, new faces flipping through old reports, asking the same questions, hearing the same silences, the case labeled cold not because anyone stopped caring, but because time had done what it always does, numb the edges, push the pain into a place people could function around. But the town never forgot, not really, and neither did the family, birthdays passing with an empty chair, holidays celebrated with a photograph on the mantel, the absence becoming its own presence, heavy and permanent. Years later, technology changed, DNA databases grew, old evidence was re-examined, but there was little to test, little to compare, and the forest kept its secrets, roots breaking down anything they touched, rain washing away footprints that were never documented, and the case stayed frozen in amber, referenced in hushed tones, brought up whenever another young woman went missing somewhere else, a reminder that sometimes people simply vanish. Then the call came, decades later, from a man whose name didn't ring bells at first, a man older now, voice rough with age and something else, something that sounded like fear or relief or both. And when detectives pulled his old address, they realized he'd lived 2 blocks from her, close enough to hear sirens, close enough to watch search parties pass by, close enough to know exactly when the town went to sleep again. They brought him in quietly, no cameras, no press, just a small interview room and a recorder clicking on. And at first he talked about the weather, about how it had been raining that week too, how Oregon rain has a way of getting into your bones. And then he stopped dancing around it and said her name, said it like it hurt his mouth, said he'd seen her that night, said he'd offered a ride, said she'd hesitated, said she'd gotten in anyway. And in that moment the case shifted, the kind of shift you can feel in your chest, because confession is a dangerous word. It promises clarity, but often delivers something far messier. He spoke in fragments, memory colliding with imagination, truth tangled with years of telling himself a story he could live with, and detectives leaned in, letting the silence do the work, knowing that once someone starts talking like this, they rarely stop on their own. Outside, the rain had started again, tapping against the windows like it was trying to listen, and in that small room the past began to breathe, every sentence pulling the town back to that night, to the streetlights, to the sound of footsteps fading, and for the first time in decades the mystery cracked open, not solved, not yet, but open enough to remind everyone that cold cases are only cold until someone decides they can't stay quiet anymore. He said he had been driving aimlessly, that word aimless hanging in the air like an excuse that had aged poorly, said he saw her walking alone, shoulders hunched against the drizzle, backpack tight against her spine, and something about that image lodged itself in his mind, a young woman on a familiar street that suddenly felt unfamiliar, and he slowed the car, rolled down the window, asked if she wanted a ride, casual, harmless, the kind of offer that happens 1,000 times without consequence, except this time she looked at him longer than usual, rain streaking across the windshield, streetlight flickering, a pause that now felt enormous in hindsight. He told detectives she smiled, said she was almost home, said she hesitated because every warning she'd ever been taught was whispering in her ear, but the rain was coming down harder, the distance longer than it looked, and she got in. The recorder picked up the sound of his breath hitching when he said that, a tiny stutter in the narrative. The first crack. He described the inside of the car in too much detail, the smell of old coffee, a jacket thrown in the back seat, the radio playing softly, details that felt rehearsed until they didn't, until his voice shifted when he talked about the silence between them, the kind of silence that grows uncomfortable, the kind that makes you aware of every mile marker, every turn you take that you didn't mean to. He said he missed the turn, said it accidentally at first, said she pointed it out, said he apologized, said he turned onto a side road to correct it, and that's where the story slowed, like his mind didn't want to go there, like the road itself resisted being remembered. Detectives let the silence stretch, the clock ticking loud enough to feel like pressure, and finally, he said the words that had probably been circling him for decades. She got scared. Fear changes stories. It sharpens some edges and blurs others. He said she asked him to stop, said her voice was tight, said his hands were sweating on the wheel, said he felt accused by the fear in her eyes, like he'd already done something wrong even though, according to him, he hadn't yet. That moment, that pivot, is where truth and justification collide, where men rewrite themselves as victims of circumstance, and detectives knew it, had heard it before in different rooms, different states, different years. He said he pulled over near the tree line, said she opened the door, said he grabbed her arm, not to hurt her, he insisted, just to explain, just to calm her down, and when he said that his voice rose defensively, the old reflex kicking in even now, even after all this time. The forest loomed in his description, dark, wet, endless, the kind of forest that swallows sound, and he said she screamed, just once, a sharp sound cut short, and he panicked, that word again, panic, the universal solvent of responsibility. He talked faster then, sentences tripping over each other, said she slipped, said she fell, said she hit her head on a rock, said everything went quiet, and the room felt smaller with every word, detectives exchanging glances that said we've heard the script, because accidents don't usually come packaged with this much explanation. He said he checked her pulse, said he shook her, said her eyes were open but empty, said he didn't know what to do, said he was terrified of prison, of ruining his life, of being blamed, and in that fear he made a choice that would echo for decades. He said he dragged her body deeper into the trees, the word dragged slipping out before he could soften it, said the ground was muddy, said his shoes were ruined, said branches scratched his arms, details again, vivid and ugly, and detectives felt the case changing shape, from absence to presence, from question marks to something solid and awful. He said he left her there, said he covered her with leaves, said he told himself someone would find her, that animals would take care of it, that time would erase what he'd done, and in a way, time had been his accomplice, rain and rot and growth doing what they do best. When he finished, the room went quiet, the recorder humming softly, and for a long moment no one spoke, because confession doesn't end a story, it begins a new one. They took him to the area he described, a stretch of forest that looked no different from any other, trees standing like witnesses that had never been questioned, and as he walked ahead of them his steps slowed, memory pulling him in directions he didn't consciously choose, and when he stopped, when he pointed, when he said here, the air felt heavy, like it remembered too. Forensic teams moved in, careful, methodical, eyes scanning the ground for anything that might have survived, a fragment of bone, a piece of fabric, something that could anchor his words to reality. And there, beneath decades of leaves and soil, they found it, not a body, not whole, but enough to confirm that a young woman had died there, enough to tie a name to the earth, enough to turn a missing person into a homicide at last. The news broke slowly, then all at once, whispers turning into headlines, the town holding its breath as details leaked out, the family receiving the call they had both dreaded and begged for, the call that said we found her, a sentence that carries both relief and devastation in equal measure. Her parents drove to the site, stood at the edge of the trees, the porch light at home finally turned off, and in that moment the cold case stopped being abstract, stopped being a cautionary tale, and became a wound reopened, raw and public. The man was charged, his face finally printed next to hers in the paper. 2 lives forever linked by one night of rain and fear. And as the case moved forward, as court dates were set, as lawyers prepared to argue intent and accident and responsibility, the town grappled with a truth that had been hiding in plain sight for 20 years. The monster hadn't come from the highway. He'd been living right there all along, watching the search, waiting for time to do its work. The arrest didn't bring silence. It brought noise, a low, relentless hum that spread through the town like power returning after a blackout. Conversations restarting where they'd been frozen for decades. Neighbors leaning across fences. Radios turned up. The same name repeated until it felt unreal that it belonged to a man who had bought groceries here, paid taxes here, nodded at strangers without anyone knowing what memory he carried behind his eyes. Detectives went back to the beginning with fresh urgency, reopening boxes that smelled like dust and old coffee, photographs curling at the edges, handwritten notes from officers long retired or long dead, and suddenly those early missteps glowed under new light. The missed calls, the vague tips, the sightings that never quite lined up. A clerk remembered a nervous man buying gloves the morning after the disappearance. A mechanic recalled mud caked under a car that didn't match the weather report. A neighbor remembered hearing an engine idle too long near the tree line. Memories sharpened by hindsight, guilt, and the permission to finally speak. The confession alone wasn't enough. Everyone knew that. Not in a courtroom where decades turn facts brittle, where defense attorneys thrive on gaps and erosion. So investigators began the slow work of corroboration, mapping his story against weather records, traffic logs, anything that could anchor that night in verifiable reality. Rainfall matched. The temperature drop matched. The timeline fit too neatly to ignore, and still, they pushed harder, pressing him again, watching for cracks, for places where rehearsed truth slipped into something more revealing. He added details without being asked, corrected himself mid-sentence, his voice flattening what he talked about the weeks after, how he'd driven past missing posters, how he'd attended a candlelight vigil without lighting a candle, how he'd stood in the crowd listening to prayers spoken for the very ground beneath his feet. The family's pain became a public thing, cameras lining the courthouse steps, microphones angled toward faces that had already given everything they had to give, and still they spoke, because silence had been their enemy for too long. They talked about birthdays that passed without candles, holidays that felt wrong, the way time warped around unanswered questions, each year stretching longer than the last. The mother said she'd always known, that her daughter hadn't just vanished, that people don't dissolve into air, and when she said it the room went still because belief, it turns out, is a kind of evidence too. The father said he'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, imagined confrontation, imagined rage, imagined closure, and none of it matched the dull ache he felt now. The knowledge that answers don't restore what was taken, they only change the shape of the loss. In court, the defense leaned hard into the word accident, rolling it across the floor like a shield, insisting there was no intent, no premeditation, that fear and confusion had spiraled into tragedy, and the prosecution countered with the long shadow of choice, the decision to drag, to hide, to lie, to let a family suffer for decades while life went on uninterrupted. Jurors listened to forensic experts describe soil layers like pages of a book, to psychologists explain panic and control, to detectives recount the night the case cracked open after years of silence. They saw photographs of the forest, sunlight filtering through branches that looked peaceful now, indifferent to the violence they'd absorbed, and they heard recordings of the confession, the pauses louder than the words, the breath that hitched at moments that mattered. Outside, the town wrestled with itself, with the uncomfortable realization that safety is often an illusion propped up by routine, that evil doesn't always announce itself, that sometimes it blends in so well it becomes part of the scenery. People revisited old choices, rides accepted, shortcuts taken, instincts ignored, and parents held their children tighter without quite knowing why. The case became a warning and a mirror, reflecting how quickly ordinary moments can fracture, how thin the line is between kindness and catastrophe. And still, questions lingered, because they always do, about whether there were others, about whether this was truly the only secret he carried, about what else time might be hiding in plain sight. As testimony dragged on, the man at the center of it all grew smaller, his confidence eroding under cross-examination, his certainty fraying as inconsistencies were pulled into the light. He struggled to maintain the careful balance between remorse and self-preservation, apologizing without fully owning, expressing regret without naming intent, and the jury watched closely, parsing every word, every twitch, every carefully chosen phrase. When he spoke directly to the family, his voice shook, and some believed it, some didn't, and the difference mattered less than the fact that it changed nothing. Apologies don't rewind time. They don't erase nights spent staring at ceilings, wondering if hope is a gift or a curse. The verdict, when it came, landed with a heavy finality that rippled outward, a collective exhale mixed with fresh grief, justice arriving late and imperfect, as it so often does. The sentence closed one chapter, but opened another. Appeals promised, paperwork piling up, the legal system grinding forward with its own indifferent momentum. For the family, there was no clean ending, only a shifting of weight, a chance to name what had been haunting them, to visit a place that now had meaning, to say goodbye to something that had never properly been laid to rest. They returned to the forest one last time, not with cameras or crowds, but with quiet, placing flowers where leaves had once hidden the truth, listening to the wind move through branches that had borne witness, without judgment. And as the story faded from headlines, as new scandals and crimes demanded attention, the case left behind a residue, a reminder etched into the town's collective memory that time doesn't heal so much as it teaches us how to live alongside scars. The road where it began looked the same, rain still falling on asphalt, cars still slowing, offers still made in moments of chance, and somewhere in that ordinariness lay the enduring unease, the knowledge that the past is never truly past, that it waits, patient and silent, for the moment someone finally dares to listen. The night kept replaying itself in fragments, not just for the family, but for the investigators now forced to inhabit it again, minute by minute, decision by decision, tracing how a single encounter metastasized into a lifetime of consequence. They reconstructed the route on maps stained with coffee rings, the stretch of highway where headlights thin out and radio signals fade, the turnout most drivers forget exists, the stand of trees dense enough to swallow sound. Each location carried a weight that hadn't been there before, as if the land itself had been waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions. Patrol logs were re-examined, dispatch tapes scrubbed for background noise, the cadence of voices analyzed for what they didn't say. A call logged as routine now felt ominous. A gap between transmissions stretched into something sinister. Time, once an ally of convenience, became the enemy, exposing how much had slipped through open fingers. Witnesses came forward with stories that had curdled inside them for years, fear and doubt keeping them quiet until the confession cracked the seal. A trucker remembered a car pulled too far off the road, hazard lights blinking like a distress signal that never quite committed. A jogger recalled a scream swallowed by wind, dismissed in the moment as imagination, as wildlife, as anything but what it might have been. Their voices shook as they spoke, the relief of confession braided tightly with regret, each word an admission that silence has consequences too. Detectives listened without judgment, because blame was a luxury they couldn't afford, because every late truth still mattered, still had the power to sharpen the picture. Forensic teams returned to the site with technology that hadn't existed the first time, tools that could read stories written in soil and bone, extracting data from fragments once deemed meaningless. They spoke in precise language about trauma patterns, about force vectors and timelines, translating violence into charts and measurements that could stand up under scrutiny. The forest yielded what it had been hiding, fibers snagged on bark, trace elements that matched materials from the suspect's vehicle, a quiet vindication of instincts that had been dismissed years earlier. Each discovery tightened the net, leaving less room for denial, less space for the defense to maneuver. Inside the suspect's past, investigators found a pattern that didn't look like a pattern at first glance, just a series of near misses and questionable moments scattered across years. Traffic stops that ended with warnings, complaints that never became reports, relationships that burned hot and ended abruptly, leaving behind stories of control and volatility that had never reached a courtroom. Alone, each incident meant little. Together, they formed a silhouette that looked uncomfortably familiar, the outline of someone who had learned how to stay just inside the lines. Psychologists dissected his behavior, talking about escalation, about how opportunity and secrecy can embolden, how the absence of consequence teaches dangerous lessons. The jury absorbed it all, not as character assassination but as context, the slow assembling of motive where none had seemed obvious before. The media frenzy intensified, feeding on the collision of past and present, on the unsettling notion that monsters don't always announce themselves. Headlines screamed about cold cases and buried truths, about justice delayed but not denied, and talk shows debated morality with the confidence of people far removed from the wreckage. The family tried to tune it out, retreating into private spaces where grief could breathe without performance, but the noise found them anyway, through screens and car radios and well-meaning strangers who didn't know what to say. They learned quickly that resolution doesn't come with instructions, that knowing how something ended doesn't explain why it began. In the courtroom, tension thickened as the prosecution unveiled its narrative, weaving confession, forensics, and witness testimony into a timeline that felt inexorable. They played audio from the interrogation room, the suspect's voice wavering as he described moments he'd tried to forget, the way his words sped up when he hit something raw, the way silence fell when he reached the point of no return. The defense objected, argued coercion, suggested false memory, the fallibility of human recall after decades of internal rehearsal. Experts countered with studies, with explanations of how memory works under stress, how certain details burn themselves in too deeply to fabricate. The judge listened, weighed, ruled, the gavel a metronome marking the slow march toward judgment. Outside the legal theater, the community grappled with its own role in the story, with the uneasy awareness that crimes don't happen in a vacuum, that environments can enable as much as they obscure. Town halls filled with anxious questions about safety, about whether this case was an anomaly or a symptom, about what vigilance really means without sliding into paranoia. Law enforcement leaders spoke about reforms, about lessons learned, about the importance of taking every report seriously, even when resources are thin and outcomes uncertain. It sounded good, necessary even, but trust is a fragile thing, and rebuilding it takes more than speeches. As days blurred together, the family found themselves oscillating between exhaustion and a strange, brittle energy, fueled by the knowledge that something was finally moving. They sorted through old belongings, letters written to someone who could never read them, photographs that captured a smile frozen at an age she'd never surpass. Each item was a reminder of the life that had been interrupted, the alternate futures that had evaporated in an instant. They talked about her in the present tense sometimes, catching themselves, refusing to correct it, because language, like memory, doesn't always obey logic. The suspect's demeanor shifted as the weight of evidence pressed in, moments of defiance giving way to visible strain. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, as testimony painted him into a corner he could no longer talk his way out of. When confronted with contradictions, he stumbled, explanations unraveling under the relentless precision of cross-examination. The mask slipped just enough to reveal flashes of anger, flashes of fear, emotions that had been tightly managed for years. Jurors took notes, their faces a study in concentration, aware that their decision would echo far beyond the room. Late one afternoon, as sunlight slanted through high windows, the prosecution rested, confidence tempered by the knowledge that nothing is certain until it's done. The defense rose, outlining its case with practiced calm, urging restraint, warning against the seductive clarity of hindsight. They spoke about reasonable doubt, about the dangers of narrative, about how time can warp both memory and motive. It was compelling in its own way, a reminder that justice demands skepticism as much as it demands empathy. The room held its breath, caught between two versions of reality, each claiming truth as its ally. And through it all, the question lingered like a low-frequency hum. What does closure actually look like when the past refuses to stay buried? The answer, it seemed, was messy and incomplete, a patchwork of relief and sorrow stitched together by necessity. As the trial moved closer to its end, as final arguments loomed, the sense of inevitability grew, not just about the verdict, but about the lasting impact of the case. Because even when the gavel falls, even when a sentence is handed down, the story doesn't dissolve. It embeds itself in memory, in cautionary tales told quietly to children, in the way people glance over their shoulders at night, in the understanding that some truths take too long to surface, and when they do, they change everything they touch. By the time closing arguments began, the room felt smaller, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to listen, carrying decades of tension in their silence. The prosecution spoke first, voice steady, measured, laying out the story one final time not as spectacle, but as inevitability, a chain of moments linked by choice, by opportunity, by the quiet confidence of someone who believed he would never be questioned. They didn't raise their voice. They didn't need to. They let the evidence speak, each piece placed carefully where it belonged, reminding the jury that this wasn't about perfect memory or cinematic certainty. It was about accumulation, about how truth emerges when enough fragments are allowed to align. They spoke of the night again, but differently now, stripped of mystery, anchored in fact. The road, the forest, the moment when fear tipped into violence, when a decision was made not once but over and over again, to conceal, to abandon, to erase. They reminded the jurors that time doesn't absolve, that waiting out the clock isn't the same as innocence, that justice delayed is still justice owed. When they finished, there was no dramatic pause, no flourish, just a quiet return to their seat, the weight of the case settling into the space they left behind. The defense followed, weaving doubt like a protective barrier, urging caution, restraint, reminding the jury of the stakes not just for the family, but for the integrity of the system itself. They questioned memory, motive, the reliability of a confession made under pressure, the temptation to fill gaps with assumptions. They spoke about alternative explanations, about how easy it is to connect dots after the picture is already framed. Their words were careful, calculated, designed to slow the momentum, to reintroduce uncertainty where clarity had begun to take hold. It was persuasive in places, unsettling in others, a reminder that truth is rarely as clean as we want it to be. When the judge dismissed the jury to deliberate, the room exhaled all at once. The family gathered close, hands intertwined, eyes fixed on the door as if willing it to reopen. Outside, reporters speculated. Experts filled airtime with analysis, and the town waited, suspended between what had been and what might finally be acknowledged. Hours stretched, then more hours, time bending in that familiar way it does when everything feels at stake. No one spoke much. Words felt inadequate, fragile things that might shatter under the pressure. Behind closed doors, jurors pored over notes, revisited testimony, replayed recordings, the gravity of their task pressing down with every tick of the clock. They argued, disagreed, circled back, weighing doubt against detail, emotion against evidence. Some struggled with the age of the case, with the idea that a life could be appended so completely so long after the fact. Others fixated on the confession, on the specificity of it, on the way certain truths resist fabrication. Slowly, painfully, consensus began to form, not because every question had been answered, but because enough had. When the knock finally came, it sounded too loud, a sharp interruption to the hush that had settled over everything. The jury filed back in, faces unreadable, the verdict folded neatly in the foreperson's hands. The family stood without realizing they were standing, breath caught somewhere between hope and dread. The defendant remained seated, staring straight ahead, his reflection faintly visible in the polished wood of the table, a man confronted at last by the permanence of what he'd done. The verdict was read aloud, each word landing with a clarity that cut through the room.
Guilty.
The sound was both deafening and impossibly quiet, a single syllable carrying decades of waiting, of unanswered prayers, of nights spent imagining this exact moment and never quite believing it would come. The mother closed her eyes, tears spilling freely now, not in triumph, but in release. The father nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, as if acknowledging a truth he had carried alone for too long. The defendant's reaction was subdued, a tightening of the jaw, a brief flicker of something like disbelief, then resignation. There was no outburst, no collapse, just the slow realization that the life he'd constructed around secrecy had finally come undone. The judge spoke again, outlining next steps, sentencing to follow, the machinery of justice continuing its methodical grind. But for the family, the legal language blurred, receding into the background as the meaning of the moment settled in. Outside the courthouse, the crowd surged, microphones thrust forward, questions shouted into the open air, but the family moved through it as if underwater, sound muffled, focus narrowed to the simple act of staying upright. When they spoke, it was with care, choosing words that honored the past without being consumed by it. They thanked those who had never let the case die, who had believed when belief felt foolish, who had understood that remembering is an act of defiance. As night fell, the town began to absorb the outcome, conversations turning inward, toward reflection rather than speculation. Some felt relief. Others felt unease. The realization that the truth had been so close all along, hiding in plain sight, left a residue of discomfort that no verdict could fully erase. People locked their doors, checked on neighbors, replayed old interactions through a new lens, searching for signs they might have missed. And in the quiet that followed, after the lights dimmed and the cameras packed away, the case settled into its new shape. No longer a question mark, no longer a rumor or a cautionary tale, but a confirmed chapter in the town's history, etched permanently into its identity. The forest remained. The road remained. Life went on, as it always does. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. The past had spoken, and it had been heard. Sentencing arrived without ceremony, a date circled on calendars that already felt heavy with history, and the courtroom filled again with a quieter intensity, less spectacle, more reckoning. This time there were no surprises left to unveil, no mysteries to tease apart, just the stark accounting of harm and consequence. The prosecution spoke of impact, of ripples that spread far beyond a single act, touching parents who aged under the weight of not knowing, siblings who grew up alongside absence, a community forced to carry a question mark for nearly 3 decades. They talked about deterrence, about the message sent when time fails to erase responsibility, and they spoke carefully, aware that punishment can never equal loss. The defense asked for mercy, framing the defendant as an aging man with declining health, arguing that prison would be a slow death sentence, that remorse, however late, should count for something. They pointed to letters of support, to a life that, on paper, looked unremarkable, even productive, and urged the court to see complexity rather than caricature. It was a familiar argument, one that landed differently now that the facts were no longer in dispute, now that the cost of those decades had been measured so publicly. When the family addressed the court, the room stilled in a way that no legal argument could command. The mother spoke first, voice steady despite the tremor beneath it, describing the way time fractured into before and after, how every knock at the door carried hope and dread in equal measure. She spoke of milestones missed, of conversations imagined, of the quiet anger that built when the world moved on without explanation. She did not shout. She did not curse. She simply named what had been taken and what could never be returned. The father followed, his words fewer but no less heavy, speaking about endurance, about how love persists even when answers do not, about how justice, though imperfect, mattered because it said out loud that what happened was wrong. The judge listened, eyes fixed forward, absorbing the weight of it all before delivering a sentence that echoed through the room with the force of finality. The terms were read slowly, deliberately, years stacking upon years, a lifetime reduced to numbers that would now define the remainder of the defendant's days. There was no dramatic reaction, just a subtle sag of the shoulders, the sound of breath leaving lungs as reality set in. The gavel fell, and with it, a chapter closed in the only way the system knows how. In the days that followed, the case began its slow retreat from the public eye, headlines shrinking, airtime reallocated, attention drifting elsewhere as it always does. But for those closest to it, the ending brought not peace, but a recalibration, a learning curve for a new reality where the question had finally been answered. Grief changed shape. It no longer circled endlessly around uncertainty, but settled into something heavier, more defined. Some days it felt easier to carry. Other days it felt sharper, now that there was no mystery left to soften its edges. Investigators returned to their desks with a mixture of pride and exhaustion, aware that while one case had been resolved, countless others remained suspended in silence. They talked about lessons learned, about the importance of preserving evidence, of listening harder, of revisiting assumptions that calcify over time. The confession had been a catalyst, but it was persistence that had carried the case across the finish line, persistence fueled by the stubborn belief that unanswered questions are unacceptable. For younger officers, the case became a touchstone, a reminder that today's routine report might be tomorrow's defining moment. The town itself moved through a period of collective introspection, the verdict acting like a mirror held too close for comfort. People re-examined memories, conversations, moments that now felt charged with new meaning. They wondered how many other truths might be hiding in plain sight, how many silences had been mistaken for peace. Community meetings shifted from outrage to prevention, discussions about lighting, patrols, education, about creating systems that make it harder for harm to disappear unnoticed. It was imperfect, uneven work, but it mattered because doing nothing had proven too costly. For the family, rituals took on new significance. They visited the place where the forest opened into quiet, not to search anymore, but to acknowledge. They brought photographs, letters, objects that had waited years for a destination, and they spoke aloud words that had once felt futile. There was sadness, yes, but also a strange clarity, a sense that memory could finally rest on solid ground. They planned a memorial, not as a reopening of wounds, but as a statement that her life had weight, that it deserved to be remembered for more than the way it ended. And yet, even as resolution settled in, it never fully erased the unease that had threaded through the story from the beginning. The knowledge that a confession had been necessary, that truth had waited decades for the right moment to surface, lingered like a warning. It suggested that justice is not automatic, that it depends on chance, on courage, on the fragile intersection of opportunity and conscience. It reminded everyone that while some stories do reach an ending, many do not, and that the distance between those outcomes is often uncomfortably thin. As seasons changed and life resumed its familiar rhythms, the case remained, not as an open wound but as a scar, visible when the light hit it just right. It lived in conversations lowered to a hush, in the way parents paused before answering questions about safety, in the collective understanding that vigilance is not paranoia but memory put to use. The mystery had been unraveled, the confession spoken, the verdict delivered, and still, the echo persisted, a quiet reminder that the past does not fade on its own. It waits, and sometimes, when least expected, it speaks. Years later, when the case had been archived under the quiet label of resolved, its presence still pulsed beneath the surface of ordinary days, surfacing in unexpected ways, in questions asked too late at night, in the reflexive tightening of the chest when a siren cut through the dark. Resolution, it turned out, was not a door that closed cleanly, but a corridor that narrowed slowly, forcing everyone who had been touched by the story to walk it at their own pace. The family discovered this first, learning that certainty does not cancel grief, it clarifies it, stripping away the haze of possibility and leaving behind the sharp outline of what was lost. They tried to build new routines around the absence that had once defined them, small acts of reclamation that felt radical in their simplicity. Sunday dinners without the undercurrent of speculation. Holidays marked by remembrance instead of unanswered questions. They spoke her name more freely now, no longer afraid that doing so would invite false hope or reopen wounds that had never fully healed. Yet even in these moments of progress, there were setbacks, days when anger surged unexpectedly, not just at the man who had taken her life, but at the time stolen, at the years consumed by not knowing, at a system that had needed a confession to finally listen. The investigators, too, carried the case forward in quieter ways, each of them changed by the experience, whether they admitted it or not. For some, it became a cautionary tale shared with rookies, a reminder that complacency is the enemy of justice, that the details dismissed today may be the ones that matter most tomorrow. For others, it was more personal, a lingering sense of responsibility that extended beyond this single outcome, fueling a renewed determination to revisit other cold cases, to question old assumptions, to treat silence not as absence, but as potential evidence waiting for the right moment. Within the department, policies shifted subtly but meaningfully. Evidence rooms reorganized, protocols updated, training sessions infused with the hard-earned lessons of the past. There was no grand announcement, no sweeping reform attributed to one case, just a gradual recalibration born of discomfort, of the realization that the margin for error had once been too wide. It was an acknowledgement that justice, like memory, requires maintenance, attention, and the willingness to confront failure without defensiveness. The community's relationship with the story evolved as well, the initial shock of the confession giving way to a more complex reckoning. Some residents felt vindicated, relieved that their unease had not been misplaced. Others grappled with guilt, replaying moments when they might have spoken up, might have asked harder questions, might have refused to accept the convenient explanations offered at the time. Conversations grew more honest, less performative, touching on the uncomfortable truth that safety is often assumed rather than ensured, that trust, once broken, demands active repair. In schools and community centers, discussions about awareness and accountability took on new urgency, framed not as fear-mongering but as empowerment, an effort to transform a painful legacy into something preventative. The story was no longer just a cautionary headline but a reference point, a reminder of what happens when warning signs are ignored, when discomfort is smoothed over in the name of normalcy. It wasn't about reliving the horror, it was about refusing to let it fade into abstraction. And still, there were nights when the past pressed in, when dreams replayed scenes no one could ever fully witness, when the confession echoed in the mind like a recording that couldn't be turned off. The family learned to sit with that discomfort, to recognize it as part of the cost of knowing, a cost they had once begged to pay. They sought counseling, leaned on one another, discovered that healing is less about forgetting and more about integrating the truth into a life that continues, whether it feels ready or not. The man responsible faded into the background of the narrative, his name mentioned less frequently as the focus shifted back where it belonged. He became a fact rather than a fixation, a reminder that while perpetrators can be identified and punished, they do not get to define the meaning of the story. That power, reclaimed slowly and deliberately, belonged to those who had endured, to the memory of the life interrupted, to the community that had been forced to grow up around a question mark. As time stretched on, anniversaries passed differently than before, marked not by renewed pleas for information but by quiet reflection, by gatherings that felt less like vigils and more like affirmations. Candles still flickered, photographs still circulated, but the tone had changed. There was sadness, yes, but also a measure of steadiness, a sense that the ground beneath their feet, once so unstable, had finally begun to hold. Yet the case never truly receded into history. It lingered in the margins, in the way detectives paused before closing files, in the way families of the missing watched the news with a mix of hope and dread, wondering if their story might one day follow a similar arc. It existed as proof that truth can surface after decades of silence, and as a warning that it often does so unevenly, dependent on variables no one can fully control. In that tension, between hope and caution, the legacy of the case took root. Not as a neat conclusion, but as a living reminder that justice is fragile, that memory is an active force, and that the line between forgotten and found is thinner than anyone wants to believe. The confession had unraveled the mystery, yes, but it had also exposed something deeper, a collective responsibility to listen harder, to wait less, to understand that silence is rarely empty. It is filled with things we have not yet learned how to hear. Time continued its quiet advance, indifferent to resolution, and with it came the long aftermath no verdict could script. The case slipped further from headlines into footnotes, but for those who had lived inside it, the story kept breathing, reshaping itself with each passing year. The family learned that closure was not a finish line, but a recalibration, a constant adjustment to a world where certainty existed alongside loss. They discovered new questions rising where old ones had finally been laid to rest, questions about identity, about who they had become while waiting, about how much of their lives had been shaped by an absence that no longer needed to be imagined. They sorted through boxes that had gone untouched for decades, artifacts of a suspended time. Letters written but never sent. Clothing carefully folded, preserved against hope. Photographs that now carried a different gravity, no longer placeholders for reunion, but proof of a life that had fully existed. Each object demanded attention, asked to be acknowledged not as evidence or memory alone, but as part of a narrative that had finally found its spine. There were tears, arguments, moments of unexpected laughter, the messy human work of integrating truth into memory. In the investigative world, the case gained a second life as a teaching tool, dissected not for spectacle, but for insight. Detectives spoke openly about missteps, about how assumptions hardened into blind spots, about how the absence of technology had once narrowed possibilities that now felt obvious in hindsight. They talked about the confession, not as a miracle, but as a reminder that answers can arrive from unexpected directions, that persistence sometimes means simply staying receptive, leaving a door open long enough for someone to finally walk through it. Cold case units across the region quietly revisited their own backlogs, inspired not by optimism alone, but by a sharpened sense of accountability. They pulled files that had gathered dust, re-examined evidence with modern eyes, reached out to witnesses long dismissed as unreliable or irrelevant. Most cases did not yield breakthroughs. Many remained stubbornly silent. But the effort itself carried meaning, a collective refusal to let time dictate worthiness. The Oregon case had proven that patience and pressure could coexist, that waiting did not have to mean surrender. The community's relationship with law enforcement evolved as well, marked by a cautious rebuilding of trust. Town halls grew more candid, residents more willing to voice concerns, officers more transparent about limitations and lessons learned. It wasn't perfect. There were setbacks, moments when old suspicions resurfaced, when progress felt fragile. But there was also a shared understanding that silence had once cost too much, that communication, however uncomfortable, was a necessary risk. For the family, public attention became something to manage rather than endure. They learned to set boundaries, to decide which questions deserved answers and which could be left untouched. They spoke at events, not to relive trauma but to honor persistence, to remind others that demanding answers is not an act of aggression but of love. Their voices carried a weight that no official statement ever could, grounded in lived experience, tempered by years of waiting. And still, in quiet moments, the confession echoed, not as a revelation anymore but as a marker in time, dividing life into before and after. The knowledge it brought was both anchor and burden, grounding the story in fact while reopening emotional terrain that uncertainty had once kept at bay. They learned to sit with that duality, to accept that peace and pain are not opposites but companions, moving together through the long arc of healing. The man at the center of the confession receded further into abstraction, his presence reduced to a name on legal documents, a figure in institutional clothing. He no longer occupied the family's imagination the way he once had. That space had been reclaimed by memories of her, by stories shared and reshaped, by a deliberate effort to let her life, not her death, define what endured. It was a quiet reclamation, but a powerful one. As years layered themselves onto the story, the case took on a different kind of significance, less about shock and more about endurance. It became a reference point for those navigating their own unanswered questions, a reminder that truth can surface even after long dormancy, but also a caution that waiting carries costs no one fully anticipates. It was no longer a symbol of mystery alone, but of the complicated aftermath that follows revelation. In the end, what lingered most was not the drama of the confession or the weight of the sentence, but the subtle, persistent transformation that followed. The way conversations changed, the way memories settled, the way a community learned, imperfectly, to listen more closely to the quiet spaces where answers often hide. The mystery had been unraveled, yes, but what remained was something deeper, a collective awareness that truth, once uncovered, does not simply conclude a story. It reshapes everyone who stands within its reach. The years that followed settled into a strange equilibrium, a balance between remembrance and movement that no one had been taught how to achieve. Life insisted on continuing, and yet the shadow of the case lingered, not as a threat but as a presence, an undercurrent shaping decisions in subtle ways. The family learned that even with answers, there would always be moments when the past rose uninvited, triggered by a sound, a smell, a passing face in a crowd. These intrusions were no longer questions, but echoes, reminders that resolution does not erase impact, it merely changes its form. They began to speak openly about the long wait, about what it means to live inside uncertainty for decades and then step out of it into a world that expects relief to look like happiness. Friends and acquaintances, unsure how to respond, often defaulted to congratulations, as if the truth were a prize finally claimed. The family learned to accept the gesture while quietly redefining it. This was not a victory. It was an ending, hard-earned and incomplete, carrying both gravity and relief in equal measure. In private moments, they revisited old conversations, reinterpreted memories through the lens of what was now known. Statements once dismissed as harmless took on sharper edges. Gaps in timelines grew clearer, no longer obscured by speculation. There was pain in this clarity, but also a strange validation. The instincts they had doubted for years, the discomfort they had been told to ignore, had not been imagined. The truth had been there, waiting, just beyond reach. The investigators who remained connected to the case found themselves reflecting more often on the concept of time, on how easily it becomes both ally and adversary. They spoke about burnout, about the emotional toll of carrying unresolved stories, about the quiet fear that comes with realizing how many cases will never benefit from a confession or a technological leap. The Oregon case had been resolved, yes, but it had also sharpened their awareness of fragility, of how dependent justice can be on circumstance rather than certainty. Some of them reached out to other families still waiting, careful not to offer false hope, but unwilling to retreat into professional distance. They understood now, perhaps more than before, that acknowledgement itself has value, that being seen and heard can sustain people even when answers remain elusive. It was a small shift, but a meaningful one, born from the understanding that silence, when prolonged, becomes its own form of harm. In the broader cultural conversation, the case joined a growing archive of stories that challenged the assumption that time heals all wounds. Commentators pointed to it as evidence that unresolved trauma does not fade. It adapts, embedding itself into families and communities, shaping behavior across generations. The narrative shifted away from sensationalism toward reflection, toward questions about how systems respond to disappearance, how society measures urgency, whose stories are prioritized, and whose are allowed to drift into obscurity. The family watched this discourse from a distance, selective about engagement, protective of what little peace they had carved out. They understood the importance of awareness, but they also understood the cost of becoming a symbol. They chose instead to focus on legacy, on ensuring that her name was associated not just with a case file, but with a life remembered accurately and fully. They funded scholarships, supported local initiatives, created spaces where her story could inspire care rather than fear. There were moments of unexpected grace. Strangers wrote letters, not asking questions, but offering gratitude, sharing how the story had prompted them to reconnect with estranged loved ones, to speak up about their own concerns, to trust their instincts more deeply. These messages did not undo the past, but they reframed its reach. suggesting that even the darkest chapters can cast light in directions no one anticipates. And still, beneath all of it, there remained a quiet unease, a recognition that this outcome, however meaningful, was not guaranteed. The confession had come not because the system demanded it at the right moment, but because an individual chose to speak after years of silence. That randomness lingered, a reminder that truth often depends on fragile human variables. It was a humbling realization, one that tempered any temptation toward closure as a clean, satisfying concept. As another decade approached, the case marked time in ways calendars could not. Anniversaries passed with less fanfare, more introspection. The family no longer counted years of not knowing, but years of knowing, measuring progress not by distance from the event, but by depth of understanding. They had learned that healing is not linear, that it loops and pauses, accelerates and stalls, guided more by internal shifts than external milestones. In quiet moments, when the world felt momentarily still, the story settled into something resembling peace, not because the pain was gone, but because it had been named, acknowledged, and woven into a larger narrative of endurance. The mystery that once dominated everything had been dismantled, piece by piece, replaced by a truth that, while painful, allowed life to move forward with intention rather than inertia. The case no longer asked questions. It offered lessons about listening, about patience, about the cost of waiting and the courage it takes to speak, even when speaking comes too late to change the outcome. And in that offering, it continued to live, not as an open wound, but as a reminder that some stories, once finally told, do not end. They evolve, carrying forward the weight of what was lost and the quiet insistence that it mattered. The truth, once spoken aloud, had altered the shape of time itself. What once felt like a long, unbroken night now revealed seams and fractures, moments where things might have gone differently, where a question asked or an instinct followed could have bent the story onto another path. This awareness settled heavily on everyone involved, not as regret alone, but as a heightened sensitivity to the present. The past could no longer be changed, but it had sharpened the edges of now. For the family, this meant learning how to exist without the vigilance that had once been second nature. They were no longer scanning crowds or dissecting headlines for familiar patterns. The constant readiness for news, good or bad, had finally loosened its grip. In its place came a quieter, more disorienting challenge, deciding who they were without the search. For decades, their identity had been entwined with the case, with advocacy, with waiting. Letting go of that role felt both liberating and frightening, like stepping off a moving platform into stillness. They spoke openly about this disorientation, about the strange guilt that accompanied moments of happiness, about the fear that moving forward might be mistaken for forgetting. Counselors reminded them that memory does not require suffering to remain intact, that honoring the past does not demand perpetual pain. These ideas took time to settle, resisted at first, then slowly absorbed as experience proved them true. Laughter returned, tentative at first, then more freely, no longer followed by immediate remorse. Within law enforcement, the case continued to reverberate, reshaping conversations about accountability and humility. Veterans spoke candidly with younger officers about the danger of certainty, about how easy it is to mistake familiarity for understanding. They emphasized that unresolved cases are not failures frozen in time, but responsibilities that age alongside the people affected by them. This shift did not erase past mistakes, but it acknowledged them in a way that felt overdue. Training sessions began to include narratives like this one, not as triumphs, but as warnings. They highlighted the importance of documentation, of preserving even the most unremarkable details, of resisting the urge to close doors simply because they had been open too long. The confession had exposed not just an individual's guilt, but a system's vulnerability to complacency. That lesson lingered, uncomfortable but necessary. The broader community continued to process the story in waves, some people still grappling with disbelief, others quietly reassessing their own memories of the time. Old rumors resurfaced, not with the power to rewrite history, but with the clarity to be understood for what they were. Conversations once avoided now felt possible, even essential. There was a collective reckoning underway, not dramatic or loud, but persistent, driven by the understanding that silence had once been mistaken for peace. For the family, public curiosity gradually softened into respect. Requests for interviews slowed. The story no longer belonged to the news cycle.
It belonged to them.
They chose carefully when to speak and when to remain private, guided by a sense of ownership that had been denied to them for so long. When they did share, it was with intention, focusing less on the crime and more on the human cost of waiting, on the resilience required to live in uncertainty and still hope. They found unexpected strength in connecting with others whose stories remained unresolved. These conversations were not about guarantees or timelines, but about endurance, about surviving the long stretches of not knowing without losing oneself entirely. They offered what they could: honesty, empathy, the acknowledgement that answers, when they come, may not arrive in the form imagined, but they still matter. As the years passed, the confession lost its shock value, settling into the historical record as a fact rather than a revelation. What remained potent was its aftermath, the way it had exposed layers of grief and responsibility that no single moment could resolve. The case had been reopened, unraveled, and closed again, but its influence persisted, shaping how people approached uncertainty, how they responded to unanswered questions in their own lives. In quieter moments, the family reflected on how much of their endurance had been built in darkness, guided by instinct rather than information. They recognized the cost of that endurance, the toll it had taken on relationships, on health, on trust. And yet, they also recognized its value, the way it had kept memory alive when forgetting would have been easier. This duality became part of their story, not a contradiction, but a testament to complexity. The mystery that once defined everything had been stripped away, revealing a truth that was neither neat nor redemptive, but real. And in that reality, there was room for growth, for mourning, for a future no longer held hostage by unanswered questions. The confession had closed a door, but beyond it lay a landscape still being mapped, one step at a time, guided not by urgency, but by intention. The case no longer demanded attention. It invited reflection. And in that reflection, it continued to shape lives, quietly, persistently, reminding everyone who encountered it that truth, when it finally surfaces, does not end a story. It changes how every chapter that follows is written. By the time the case reached what officials called resolution, the word itself had lost its simplicity. Resolution suggested a straight line, a clean break, but nothing about this journey had ever been clean. The truth had arrived late, distorted by time, filtered through memory and motive, and it carried with it consequences that did not fit neatly into legal definitions. What followed was not relief, but reckoning. The confession forced institutions to look inward. Files were reopened not to find new suspects, but to trace old decisions. Why certain leads were deprioritized. Why some voices were dismissed while others were amplified. Meetings were held behind closed doors, not for optics, but for survival, because the case had become a mirror, and what it reflected was uncomfortable.
Procedures were revised.
Language changed. Words like unlikely and unsubstantiated were reconsidered, recognized for how easily they could become excuses. For the detectives who had worked the case in its earliest days, the confession landed like a delayed impact. Some were retired now, their careers already summarized in plaques and farewell speeches. Others were gone entirely, their answers permanently out of reach. Those still alive grappled with a mix of vindication and regret. Vindication that the case had not been imagined, that the unanswered questions had been real. Regret that the answers had come too late to change outcomes, too late to correct trajectories already set. The family watched this process with a careful distance. They had learned, through years of waiting, that proximity to the system did not guarantee protection. They listened when invited, spoke when asked, but no longer chased validation from official channels. The confession had given them something more durable than acknowledgement. It had given them certainty, and certainty, once achieved, proved strangely resistant to erosion. In private, the emotional landscape continued to shift. Anger surfaced in unexpected ways, not explosive, but precise, directed at moments long past, at decisions that now felt avoidable. There were days when grief felt sharper than it ever had during the years of uncertainty, sharpened by the clarity of what had been taken. There were also days of calm, grounded by the knowledge that the story no longer required imagination to complete it. The person who had confessed became a study in absence. Their explanation, parsed and reparsed, offered facts but little meaning. Motive remained thin, insufficient to account for the magnitude of harm. Psychologists weighed in, analysts debated, but the family understood something those discussions often missed. Explanation does not equal understanding. Knowing what happened does not automatically explain why it mattered so deeply or why it echoed for so long. In the community, memory reorganized itself. People revised their internal timelines, adjusted assumptions, reclassified rumors as warnings missed. The story shifted from legend to lesson. Parents spoke differently to their children. Neighbors paid closer attention. The idea that something so devastating could hide in plain sight for decades unsettled long-held beliefs about safety and familiarity. Media attention returned briefly, then receded again, leaving behind a quieter, more reflective discourse. This was no longer a spectacle. It was a case study in endurance, in the cost of silence, in the fragile mechanics of truth. The family declined most requests, choosing instead to protect the fragile equilibrium they had built. They understood now that peace was not something granted by outcomes, but something actively maintained. As time moved forward, the case found its place in institutional memory, cited in policy discussions, referenced in training manuals, remembered as a turning point not because it was solved, but because of how long it wasn't. It became shorthand for what happens when persistence collides with time, when answers arrive long after the questions have reshaped lives. And still, in the quiet spaces between conversations and obligations, the weight of it all remained. Not heavy enough to crush, but present enough to be felt. A reminder that truth does not restore what was lost. It redefines what remains. The mystery had been unraveled, yes, but the story was no longer about the mystery. It was about aftermath. About learning to live in a world where the unknown had finally spoken, and what it said could never be unheard. There was a moment, sometime after the legal language had settled and the last procedural steps were completed, when the world seemed to exhale. Not in celebration, not in relief, but in recognition. The case had crossed a threshold. It was no longer suspended between questions. It had weight now, gravity pulling it firmly into the past, even as its influence continued to ripple outward. For the family, this shift was felt most strongly in the smallest routines. Simple decisions, once fraught with invisible calculations, began to feel lighter. They noticed it when making plans without contingency, when committing to future dates without hesitation, when allowing themselves to imagine years ahead rather than merely enduring the present. These were quiet changes, almost imperceptible, but together they marked a transformation that decades of uncertainty had delayed. They began sorting through belongings that had remained untouched for years, preserved not out of sentimentality alone, but because opening those boxes had once felt like reopening the wound itself. Now, with the truth established, the objects took on a different quality. They were no longer artifacts of a mystery. They were remnants of a life. Photographs were studied not for clues, but for expressions, gestures, moments of ordinary joy. Letters were read without searching between the lines. The past, once interrogated, was finally allowed to simply exist. This process brought both comfort and sorrow. There was grief in recognizing how much time had been lost to waiting, how many milestones had passed under the shadow of not knowing. There was also gratitude, unexpected and complex, for the resilience that waiting had forged. The family had survived something that reshaped them fundamentally, and while they would never claim it made them stronger in a celebratory sense, it had made them deeply attuned to one another, bound by an understanding few others could share. Within the investigative community, the case continued to prompt reflection long after its official closure. Younger detectives studied it with a mixture of fascination and caution, aware that they were inheriting both its lessons and its limitations. Veterans spoke about it less often, but when they did, their tone carried a subdued intensity. This was not a story of triumph. It was a reminder of how fragile certainty can be, how easily momentum can stall, how much depends on persistence sustained over years that offer little encouragement. The confession itself remained a point of quiet debate, not because its validity was questioned, but because of its timing. Why now? Why after so long? Analysts proposed theories rooted in psychology, in aging, in conscience, in fear. None of them fully satisfied. The truth, it seemed, was less elegant than any explanation. Sometimes people speak not because conditions are perfect, but because silence becomes heavier than exposure. That realization unsettled those who had built careers on predictability. In the community, the case's resolution altered the collective memory of the era in which it occurred. What had once been remembered as a time of relative calm was now understood as something more complicated. Stories resurfaced, not all of them directly connected, but linked by a shared awareness that danger does not always announce itself. Conversations shifted from nostalgia to scrutiny, from assumption to awareness. It was an uncomfortable but necessary recalibration. The family observed these changes from a careful distance. They had learned the cost of proximity, of allowing their pain to be consumed by public curiosity. Now they chose boundaries deliberately. When they spoke, it was to advocate for patience, for evidence preservation, for listening when concerns are raised, even when they disrupt convenient narratives. They spoke not as symbols, but as people who had lived through the consequences of being unheard. Privately, they continued to navigate the emotional terrain left behind by the case. There were days when the finality felt grounding, when certainty provided a stable platform from which to grieve. There were other days when anger surged unexpectedly, directed not only at the individual responsible, but at the years themselves, at the relentless passage of time that had taken so much without pause. These emotions coexisted, no longer in conflict, but in dialogue, each informing the other. The absence at the center of the story remained. No resolution could change that, but its shape had changed. It was no longer an open question, a void demanding answers. It was a known loss, defined and acknowledged. This distinction mattered more than anyone outside the experience could easily understand. To know what happened did not lessen the pain, but it allowed the pain to be placed somewhere, rather than carried everywhere. As months passed, the case receded further into the background of daily life. Not forgotten, never that, but integrated. It no longer dictated the rhythm of existence. It became one thread among many, significant but not singular. The family began to recognize moments of genuine peace, not because the past had been resolved, but because it no longer dominated every thought. In this new equilibrium, the story continued to teach. It taught patience without romanticizing endurance. It taught vigilance without paranoia. It taught that truth, when delayed, still matters, and that the act of uncovering it, however late, carries its own form of justice. Not the justice of restoration, but the justice of recognition. The mystery that had once defined everything was gone. In its place stood a truth that demanded responsibility, reflection, and care. And in living with that truth, the family, the community, and those who had carried the case learned something enduring, that even after decades of silence, the past can still speak, and when it does, it reshapes the future in ways both subtle and profound. Time did what it always does after the noise fades. It stretched. It thinned the sharp edges of public attention and replaced them with long, quiet days where the meaning of everything had to be renegotiated. The case, once a constant presence, no longer dictated the rhythm of mornings or the weight of nights. And yet it never fully disappeared. It lived in pauses, in glances exchanged without words, in moments when the mind drifted backward without warning. For the family, the future no longer felt like a threat, but it did feel unfamiliar. For years, forward motion had been postponed, delayed by the expectation that answers were still coming. Now that they had arrived, the space ahead felt wide, almost too open. Plans were made slowly. Decisions were measured not by fear, but by a careful awareness of how fragile certainty can be. They had learned, the hard way, that life can fracture without notice and that knowledge never truly leaves you. They began to mark time differently, not by anniversaries of disappearance or discovery, but by personal milestones reclaimed from the shadow of the case. Birthdays regained their meaning. Holidays felt less heavy. There were moments when joy arrived unannounced, surprising in its ease, followed by brief flashes of disbelief, as if happiness itself needed permission now. Over time, those moments grew longer, more frequent, until they no longer felt like exceptions. The truth had altered relationships in subtle ways. Some bonds deepened, forged through shared endurance. Others quietly faded, unable to survive the long years of tension and unresolved grief. The family accepted this without bitterness. They understood that prolonged trauma reveals fault lines that were always present, testing patience, loyalty, and emotional capacity. What remained was smaller, but stronger, rooted in mutual understanding rather than obligation. In professional circles, the case continued to echo as a cautionary tale. Conferences referenced it not for its dramatic resolution, but for its timeline, for the years lost between evidence collected and evidence understood. Experts spoke about technological limits, about missed opportunities, about the ethical responsibility to revisit what has been set aside. The story became less about what went wrong in one investigation and more about what can go wrong in any system that assumes time will erase relevance. There was a growing recognition that cold cases are not static. They age alongside the people they affect. Witnesses forget or pass away. Evidence degrades. Context shifts. And yet, the Oregon case proved that even in this erosion, fragments can survive, waiting for the right moment, the right question, the right willingness to look again. That realization carried both hope and unease. The individual who had confessed receded from focus, becoming a fixed point rather than an active presence. Their words remained, recorded and analyzed, but the family chose not to dwell on them. The confession had served its purpose. It had filled the silence. Beyond that, it offered nothing that could restore what was taken. Obsession with motive or remorse felt hollow. What mattered was not their internal reckoning, but the external truth now established. In moments of reflection, the family spoke about forgiveness, but not in absolutes. They rejected the idea that forgiveness was required for healing or that it followed a predictable path. For them, healing came from acknowledgement, from no longer having to justify their pain or their persistence. If forgiveness ever arrived, it would do so quietly, on its own terms, without performance or expectation. The community continued to adjust, carrying the case forward in altered form. It became part of local history, taught not as folklore, but as fact. New residents learned of it not through whispers, but through documented memory. The story lost its mystique, replaced by something more sobering and more useful: understanding. Understanding that ordinary places can hold extraordinary darkness. Understanding that attention, when withheld, has consequences. As the years progressed, the family found themselves increasingly focused on the present. The past no longer demanded constant vigilance. It remained important, honored, but it did not consume. They learned that remembrance and living are not opposing forces, that it is possible to carry loss without allowing it to define every step forward. This balance was not achieved all at once. It was practiced imperfectly every day. The case had once been a question mark suspended over everything. Now, it was a statement, a truth, heavy and undeniable, but finite. And in that finitude, there was space to breathe. The mystery had unraveled, but what remained was not emptiness. It was a quieter landscape shaped by endurance, by lessons learned too late, but not without impact. The story no longer screamed. It whispered. And those who listened carefully understood that its power lay not in its shock, but in its persistence, in the way it continued to shape lives long after the headlines faded, reminding everyone that answers, when they finally come, change more than the past. They change how the future is lived. By the time the story reached its later years, The urgency that once defined every conversation had transformed into something quieter, heavier, more deliberate. The case no longer erupted into daily thought like an open wound. Instead, it settled into the background like a deep ache, noticeable not because it demanded attention, but because it had become part of the body itself. Everyone touched by it learned to move with that weight, adjusting posture, pace, expectation. For the family, this stage was marked by a strange clarity. The truth had removed uncertainty, but it had also stripped away illusion. There was no longer room to imagine alternative endings, no comforting fantasy in which a different choice or a missed detail might have changed everything. The narrative was fixed now, unyielding. And yet, in that finality, there was a sense of grounding. They were no longer suspended between hope and fear. They were standing on solid ground, even if that ground was cold. They spoke less often about the crime itself and more about its impact, about how waiting had altered their sense of time, how years of unanswered questions had trained them to listen for bad news, to distrust quiet, to interpret normal delays as ominous signs. Unlearning those instincts took effort. Peace did not arrive automatically with answers. It had to be rebuilt, deliberately, through repetition, reassurance, and patience with themselves. Certain places still carried a charge. Streets, buildings, familiar routes that had once been backdrops to ordinary life now felt marked, permanently altered by association. The family did not avoid them, but they approached them with awareness, sometimes choosing to confront the memory head-on, sometimes choosing distance. Both choices were valid. Healing, they learned, is not linear, and it does not demand consistency to be real. Within the justice system, the case continued to serve as a reference point, not loudly but persistently. It appeared in footnotes of policy reviews, in quiet conversations between colleagues, in moments when someone hesitated before dismissing a lead. Its influence was subtle but enduring. It reminded professionals that closure is not a switch to be flipped, that behind every file number is a network of lives absorbing the consequences of delay. There were discussions about responsibility, about whether accountability could or should extend beyond the individual who confessed. These conversations were careful, measured, often unresolved. Blame, once introduced, tends to spread outward, touching systems, cultures, assumptions. Some resisted this, preferring to isolate fault. Others argued that isolation was precisely what had allowed the case to remain dormant for so long. The tension between these views never fully resolved, but it did encourage scrutiny where there had once been complacency. The community's relationship with the story continued to evolve. It was no longer something spoken about in hushed tones or dramatic retellings. It became quieter, more reflective. Teachers referenced it when discussing civic responsibility. Local journalists treated it with restraint rather than sensationalism. The case matured, losing its shock value but gaining depth, understood now as a long arc rather than a single moment of violence. For the family, one of the most profound changes was internal. The vigilance that had once defined their days slowly loosened. They stopped bracing for impact. They allowed themselves to trust moments of calm without immediately questioning their legitimacy. This shift did not erase grief. It reframed it. Grief became something they carried consciously rather than something that ambushed them without warning. They found meaning in small rituals, acts of remembrance that did not demand public recognition. Lighting a candle on an ordinary evening, returning to a place that held significance, not to relive the pain, but to acknowledge survival. These gestures were not about closure. They were about continuity, about honoring what had been lost while affirming what remained. As time moved forward, the case ceased to define their identity in the eyes of others. New acquaintances did not know the story. Some longtime friends no longer mentioned it. This anonymity was both strange and welcome. It allowed the family to exist without explanation, to be present without context. For the first time in decades, their lives were not immediately tethered to a tragedy. And yet, the story was never truly gone. It lived in memory, in the quiet confidence that comes from having endured something profound and survived. It lived in the way they responded to uncertainty, with patience rather than panic. It lived in their empathy for others navigating unresolved loss. The case had reshaped them, not visibly, but fundamentally. As the years accumulated, the urgency faded, but the significance did not. The cold case had been reopened, unraveled, and laid to rest, but its legacy persisted in quieter forms, in changed procedures, in softened assumptions, in people who learned, too late perhaps, but not without consequence, that truth delayed is not truth denied, but it carries a cost that echoes long after it arrives. What remained was not resolution in the cinematic sense. There were no sweeping gestures, no final sense of triumph. There was only a gradual settling, a recalibration of life after certainty. And in that settling, there was a fragile, hard-won peace, not because the past had been repaired, but because it had finally been faced, fully and without illusion. In the end, what remained was not the echo of sirens or the sharp punctuation of headlines, but a quieter understanding that settled slowly, almost imperceptibly, into everyday life. The case no longer announced itself. It did not demand attention. It existed as a fixed point in the past, acknowledged, integrated, no longer chasing those who had once been trapped inside it. The mystery that had consumed years had finally released its grip, not with force, but with resignation. For the family, this final phase was not about moving on, a phrase that never fit comfortably, but about moving forward with awareness. They understood now that survival after truth is its own discipline. It requires patience. It requires permission to live without constantly looking back over one's shoulder. It requires accepting that some questions, even when answered, leave impressions that never fully fade. They learn to carry those impressions without letting them dictate every choice. The absence that had defined so much of their existence was still there, but it no longer dominated the landscape. It had a place. It had boundaries. It no longer bled into every moment uninvited. This shift was subtle, cumulative, built from thousands of ordinary days lived without the constant pressure of the unknown. Each day added a layer of distance, not from memory, but from captivity. They spoke, occasionally, about what the case had taught them, but not in slogans or sound bites. They spoke about listening when something feels wrong, about resisting the urge to simplify pain, about the danger of assuming time will solve what only attention can address. These conversations were not performances. They were offerings shaped by experience rather than theory. The justice system moved on, as it always does, absorbing the case into its archives, its statistics, its lessons learned and sometimes forgotten. New cases took precedence. New urgencies emerged. And yet, for those who had been closest to it, this story remained a reference point, a reminder that every unresolved file represents lives paused, altered, reshaped by uncertainty. It reinforced a truth that could never be fully institutionalized, that behind every delay is a human cost. The community continued its quiet recalibration. The story became part of its collective memory, not as an open wound, but as a scar, visible if you know where to look. Evidence of something endured. Evidence of vulnerability survived. It influenced how people spoke about safety, about trust, about the thin line between normalcy and rupture. It encouraged attentiveness, not fear. Awareness, not suspicion. And slowly, almost without noticing, life expanded again. The future regained dimension. Plans extended further ahead. The present became more than a holding pattern. This did not happen because the past had been resolved, but because it had been acknowledged, named, and given its rightful place. The truth had done what it could. The rest belonged to time. The case that once refused to end had finally settled into silence. Not the silence of secrecy or denial, but the silence that follows understanding. The kind that allows space for breathing, for remembering without reliving, for honoring without remaining trapped. There was no final image, no closing line that could encapsulate what had been lost or what had been learned. There was only continuation. Life, imperfect and ongoing, shaped but not defined by what had come before. The mystery had ended, but the story did not. It simply changed tone, moving away from suspense and into something quieter, steadier, more human. And in that quiet, the most enduring truth revealed itself. Not that every cold case will be solved. Not that justice always arrives on time. But that truth, when it finally emerges, even decades late, has the power to release the living from the weight of waiting. To return time its forward motion. To remind those left behind that while the past cannot be rewritten, the future, once freed from uncertainty, can finally begin.